Until 1598, Kerry had been little touched by the 9 Years' War. However, Hugh O'Neill's defeat of Henry Bagnall at the Yellow Ford and the destruction of the main English army transformed the war. A few years later, Kerry would very dramatically be brought into the war. This is where the last video ended. The Yellow Ford was important not only because it was the heaviest English defeat in the war, and because it changed it from a localized conflict to a national, even international one, but also because it marked a dramatic change in the nature of the war itself. Elizabeth was forced by the defeat to finally loosen control over her treasury and send a massive army to Ireland. The previous mixture of fighting, raids and negotiations were brought to an end. Moreover, in the aftermath of the Yellow Ford, O'Neill's Confederacy spread over most of the country, meaning that apart from Dublin and the other towns and cities, most of the rest of Ireland had to be won back by the English. As mentioned in the previous video, in the 16th century, the county of Kerry only included North and West Kerry. Here, most of the lords were Old English. Until his death in 1583, the most important had been the Earl of Desmond. Other important lords included two Geraldines, Lord Fitzmaurice of Listowel, known as Lord Kerry, and the Knight of Kerry based near Ventry. There was also one Gaelic lord, O'Connor Kerry, whose seat was at Carrigafoyle on the River Shannon. Evora was not part of the county of Kerry. Rather, it was part of Desmond, Desmuin or South Munster, the Lordship of MacCarthy Moor. Desmond covered the Evora Peninsula, Killarney, Beara and other parts of West Cork. In addition to MacCarthy Moor, other important Gaelic septs in this part of Kerry included various MacCarthy groups, O'Sullivan Moor, O'Sullivan Beara, other O'Sullivan septs such as MacCrahan and McGillicuddy, and O'Donoghue, who had an important castle at Ross outside Killarney. Following the defeat of the Second Desmond Rebellion and the death of Gerald Fitzgerald, the last Earl of Desmond in 1583, an extensive colonisation scheme was established in Munster, known as the Plantation of Munster. Around 600,000 acres confiscated from Desmond and other rebels were handed over to the new planters, who included Walter Raleigh and the poet Edmund Spenser. Like all plantation schemes at that time, it failed to meet expectations. However, it did introduce a large number of English colonists to the province, probably around 3,000 of them. The number of government soldiers in the province at this stage was minimal. It was supposed that the planters would provide their own defence in accordance with the rules of the plantation. This belief would prove to be fatally flawed. Kerry, Castle Island, Tralee and outfought, amongst various other areas, were all granted to settlers. Notable among the New English were Edward Denny, who received 6,000 acres, including Tralee, and William Herbert, who received 13,000 acres, including Castle Island. In outfought, John Crosby gained land and in 1600 would become the Protestant Bishop of Kerry. Crosby, whose family would survive the tumults of the 17th century and become a firm part of the ascendancy, was actually Gaelic. He was originally named Sean MacCrosson, but very successfully anglicised himself. Two lordships near Killorglin, the lordships of Ona and Cushmain, escaped the plantation because MacCarthy Moor successfully argued that this land was his, held by his vassals who had died in the Desmond Rebellion. It's worth mentioning again the role of lordship. Early modern Europe was a strictly hierarchical society. Lords were regarded as the natural leaders of society. However, Elizabeth made a serious mistake by refusing to incorporate Gaelic and Old English lords into her administration in Ireland. She was contemptuous of Gaelic culture, as were most of the English elite, believing that it needed to be reformed, by the sword if necessary, to draw on Brendan Bradshaw's metaphor, a belief becoming increasingly common among the English elite. To make matters worse, the majority of Old English had remained Catholic. They were thus regarded as potential traitors and as having degenerated by the English Protestant elite. Accordingly, the natural leaders of Ireland were undermined throughout the Elizabethan era. While Elizabeth regarded Hugh O'Neill and others as overmighty lords, she was willing to overlook her own minor officials building up their own power and lordships. O'Neill was aware of this, and was able to tap into a vein of discontent caused by this. The deaths of the Earl of Desmond and Donald MacCarthy More, who died in 1597, thus created an impediment for O'Neill, as it left a serious vacuum of power in Munster, particularly in Kerry. This vacuum was aggravated by the strategic location of the lands of these lords. O'Neill had been successful in attracting support from Spain for his rebellion. An expedition from Spain was expected at some stage. For geographic reasons, Munster was the most likely place for a Spanish landing. South Munster, notably West Cork and South Kerry, or Desmond, were vital for O'Neill. He thus had to bring his war and his confederacy to Munster as a matter of urgency. Let us now move to the downfall of the Munster Plantation. The aftermath of the Yellow Fort gave O'Neill the opportunity he needed to send his confederacy into Munster. At the end of September, O'Neill sent Tyrrell and O'Neill More into Munster. It was probably a speculative raid aimed at stirring up the province. O'More and Tyrrell probably had a force of less than 1,000 men, many of whom were Bonnocks from Connacht led by Redmond and William Burke and Dermot O'Connor. Sir Thomas Norris, the English Lord President of Munster, was aware of the impending attack and called for the rising out, a sort of general levy, to meet in Kilmallock at the beginning of October. Initially only 100 horse and 300 foot, mostly Kern, turned up, leaving Norris in an extremely weak position. More men would arrive afterwards, though, increasing his infantry to around 600. Whether through misinformation, panic, or in an effort to obtain reinforcements from London, in his reports Norris exaggerated the number of Tyrrell and O'More's men to 2,000. By way of contrast, William Weaver, taken prisoner at the beginning of October, gave the number of rebels as mustered on the 10th of October 77 horse and 1,098 foot. He gives an interesting breakdown of the numbers for each lord, so his figures appear to be reasonably accurate. Instantly, the horse had all come from Munster. James Fitz Thomas had 60, his brother John 7, and the final 10 belonged to Rory MacShee and Maurice MacThomas Oge, also local lords. In other words, the Confederates had managed to advance deep into Munster, passing through Ormond's lands, and from there into the heart of the English plantation without any cavalry. Gaelic horse were no match for the English ones, but they still carried out essential military tasks, notably scouting, raiding, protecting the foot, obtaining intelligence about what or who lay ahead, and preventing ambushes or unwanted encounters with enemy troops. That Tyrrell and O'More could advance so far without any cavalry in what was essentially a long-range raid illustrates the fragility of the government in the province, a fragility that soon would be revealed. Despite not being heavily outnumbered, Norris did not attempt to attack the Confederates. He had been told by one of the local loyal lords, Lord Barry, also known as Viscount Butterfont, that the Irish part of his force, in other words the majority of his troops, could not be trusted. Afterwards, a local landholder told Norris that 5,000 rebels were mustering nearby. Norris panicked and bolted for safety in Mallow and then, afterwards, Cork. This panic effectively caused the collapse of the plantation. Tyrrell and O'More were actually still in Tipperary when they heard of Norris's flight. In early October, they entered Limerick, burning, raiding, and marauding at will. Unopposed at first by any government forces or by planters, and with only a few castles or towns holding out against them, Tyrrell and O'More's force raged through Limerick, sending out raiding parties into other counties, including Kerry. This resulted in various Old English and Gaelic lords adhering to the Confederacy, some to save their lands from plunder, others because they were former supporters of Desmond and were discontent with the political situation in Munster. Many of the latter would actually prove to be the best supporters of the Confederates in Munster. Among the new supporters were the Baron of Listowel, also called the Baron of Kerry, the Knight of Glin, the Knight of Kerry, the White Knight, all of whom were Geraldines, and O'Connor Kerry. Two important Butler lords, relatives of Ormond, also joined the rebellion, Thomas Butler, Baron of Kerr, and Richard Butler, Viscount Mountgarret. The latter was regarded as so important that he married O'Neill's daughter. It's worth noting that the majority of these Munster lords were Old English, something which seems to have generally gone unnoticed in the historiography. The dominant Gaelic lords in this part of Munster were MacCarthy Mór and Donogh O'Brien, the Earl of Thomond. Although Thomond at this stage was part of Connacht, its location meant that the Earl had an important influence on part of Munster. However, Thomond himself was thoroughly anglicised and pro-English, having been raised a Protestant in London, while MacCarthy Mór, as mentioned, had died. This left a vacuum of lordship and leadership in Gaelic Munster, especially in the west of the province, one that would soon prove the Confederates dear. It was not just Gaelic Munster that was experiencing this vacuum in lordship. It was also felt among the Old English. The absence of an Earl of Desmond cast a long shadow. This is illustrated by the fact that the most important Old English lord to join the Confederacy at this moment was no lord, at least not according to English law. James Fitz Thomas Fitzgerald, the James Fitz Thomas mentioned above, claimant to the Earldom of Desmond. His father, Thomas Rua, was the eldest son of the 13th Earl of Desmond, but the latter had the marriage annulled, or more vulgarly, he put away his wife, and disinherited his eldest son, who was also made illegitimate. His grandfather's legal shenanigans meant that legally Fitz Thomas was no lord, although legal process had clearly been abused. From the Gaelic perspective, however, he was still a lord, one worthy of inheriting the earldom. James Fitz Thomas initially tried to reverse the misfortune the misuse of the legal system had dealt him. He tried to be a good subject and fought on the government side against his uncle in the Desmond War. After the death of his uncle, he petitioned Elizabeth to be made Earl. However, the Queen, never missing an opportunity to make a wrong decision in Ireland, refused to do this. Little wonder Fitz Thomas turned to O'Neill, or perhaps better, was forced to turn to O'Neill. He arrived in the Confederate camp with only 20 followers, but soon afterwards was made Earl of Desmond by O'Neill. Fitz Thomas was initially hesitant about joining the Confederates. Indeed, Ormond wrote to him on 8 October warning him not to rebel, reminding him of his father's loyalty and the fate of his uncle, the last Earl, killed in 1583. Ormond's letter did not deter Fitz Thomas from joining the Confederacy. It might even have contributed to his decision, with its boast about the Queen's army seeming hollow in light of the Yellow Ford, and reminding Fitz Thomas that his and his father's loyalty had gone unrewarded. His suit to implement the promise made to him by the Queen to consider reinstating him as Earl after the death of his uncle had gone unanswered and ignored, while at the same time the lands which were rightfully his were given to others. Furthermore, English undertakers were now greedily seeking both more lands and, in order to get these lands, threatening the lives of the Gaelic and Old English lords of the province. Fitz Thomas' grievances, caused by unfulfilled promises, unrewarded service, and the threat of the loss of land and life, were probably shared by many lords joining O'Neill's Confederacy throughout the country, as well as a common desire to protect their land from being attacked if they did not join. However, Fitz Thomas had another reason, one he could not mention. If he had not joined the Confederacy, then O'Neill would have found another claimant to the earldom. For O'Neill, the position, the respect it demanded, and the power it implied were more important than the person filling it. Indeed, according to at least one English observer, Fitz Thomas had been told if he did not accept the title from O'Neill, it would be given to his brother. Returning to the progress of Tyrrell and O'More, the situation was stabilised somewhat by the appearance of the Earl of Ormond near Kilmallock. Rather than fight him, the Gaelic force moved off, dividing into two. One group swept through County Cork, the other through North Kerry and Limerick. Both captured castles, burned houses, and killed the English they came across. Among the lands plundered were those of Lord Barry, who detailed his losses in a 6-page document. 54 towns burnt, 9,400 cows, 4,800 horses, 58,800 sheep and pigs lost, as well as 8,200 pounds worth of crops and household stuff. The punishment meted out to Lord Barry also encouraged other lords to adhere to O'Neill's Confederacy, at least while there was a Confederate raiding force marching at will through the province. Shortly afterwards, O'Neill More and much of the Ulster contingent left Munster, though Tyrrell and many Connacht Bonnocks remained in the province. They had done what O'Neill had sent them to do, bring the war to Munster. Indeed, they had achieved more than this. In a little over 2 weeks they had overthrown the plantation and driven the government out of large parts of Munster. Having been brought under government rule at such a cost in the 1580s, it would now have to be pacified and conquer all over again. With the exception of Ormond, the Confederate raiding party had met with little resistance. Many of the castles they captured had been abandoned by their owners. Apart from Mallow and Kilmallock, the only major resistance encountered was at the old Geraldine castle of Askeaton, now owned by Captain Francis Berkeley. Besieged for 3 days, Berkeley was in the end relieved by Ormond. In Kerry, little was left of the plantation, or indeed the English administration. Castle Island, Fairies, Tralee and Tarbert had all been abandoned by the settlers. According to one source, the English in Kerry had run away, quote, when there was no rebel within 40 miles of them, end quote. This was somewhat of an exaggeration. Some fighting did take place in Kerry, but the English settlers in general had fled quickly. By way of contrast, the old English town of Dingle had not fallen to the rebels, though it was extremely isolated and would be raided on various occasions. Nor had Castlemaine. Apart from Dingle, it was the last English garrison in Kerry. It was besieged, and would remain under siege for over a year. A ship was sent to relieve it, but it was captured. Eventually the garrison was forced to surrender, and were granted terms. Elizabeth was now forced to send the Earl of Essex to Ireland with a huge army. This was a potentially dangerous move. After all, she had just placed a large force in the hands of someone who was politically alienated from her. With this force, Essex could have turned on the Queen and removed her. Despite the propaganda about Elizabeth in the 1590s, inflation, bad harvests, an aging Queen herself, and non-ending wars, especially in Ireland, were rapidly reducing her popularity. Essex attempted a coup when it was too late. If he had attempted it earlier, he might have been successful. I do not have space here to discuss Essex's time in Ireland. It ended in failure, and though he spent a considerable period in Munster, he had no real impact on Kerry. This remained largely in the hands of O'Neill's supporters throughout 1599. However, southern Munster, Desmond, Kerry and Cork exposed the limitations of O'Neill's Confederacy. This was a confederacy of elites, of lords. It was dependent on their support. In turn, lords knew how to play the political game and changed their support from government to O'Neill and back to the government. As mentioned previously, the 2 most important noble titles of Munster were the Old English Earldom of Desmond and the Gaelic MacCarthy More Lordship. Since the death of the Earl of Desmond in 1583 and his younger brother in 1581, the title had been in abeyance, and there were few strong claimants to the title. O'Neill chose the most obvious one, while in 1600 Elizabeth would choose the other one, raising the son of the last Earl of Desmond, who had been brought up as a Protestant in England, to the earldom. However, he would achieve little. The MacCarthy lordship was fragmented. It was divided into 3 main lordships: MacCarthy More, which was the largest, hence its name, MacCarthy Ray of Carberry, and MacCarthy of Muskerry. Both of the latter mostly remained loyal. However, they were relatively minor lordships. The MacCarthy More lordship was the main prize. Donald MacCarthy More had been made Earl of Clancarty in 1565. His son and heir, the Baron of Valentia, had died in 1585, meaning that the fate of his land was tied to his daughter Ellen. To complicate things, a large amount of MacCarthy More land had been mortgaged to Valentine Brown, who also attempted to negotiate a marriage between his son Nicholas and Ellen MacCarthy More. This was cut across by Ellen's marriage in 1588 to Florence MacCarthy, who was the son of the Lord of MacCarthy Ray. Florence thus had a chance of controlling 2 of the 3 MacCarthy lordships. However, this did not occur. His uncle obtained a MacCarthy raid title, while Florence was moved to obtain a MacCarthy Moor. One were blocked by the English authorities. Florence was also imprisoned in the Tower of London for a number of years, basically for making himself the legal heir to Donald MacCarthy Moor. Added to the mix were an illegitimate son of the latter, also called Donald, lawsuits over land, and tensions within the MacCarthy-Ray lordship. The MacCarthy-Moor lordship was thus in a vacuum, with clashes between the various claimants to the title being relatively common. O'Neill needed to overcome the divisions within the MacCarthys, and most importantly ensure that a new MacCarthy-Moor took power, one accepted as legitimate within the lordship, with the virtue to impose himself, who was competent in military and political terms, and who supported O'Neill's Confederacy. Obviously, this perfect lord did not exist. Indeed, the options were actually very restricted. There seems to have been only 2 choices: Donald, the illegitimate son of the Earl of Clancarty, and Florence MacCarthy. The latter would remain in prison or house arrest in England until late 1599, fighting for the right to inherit Clancarty's lands and to improve the terms on which he received these, as he was aware of the developments in Ireland and was determined to take advantage of them. Donald MacCarthy, in the meantime, claimed the right to be MacCarthy Moor and Earl of Clancarty. However, he faced an insurmountable difficulty. O'Sullivan Moore refused to legitimate Donald by giving him the white rod, in other words, to perform the traditional inauguration ceremony. This prevented Donald from being able to claim the lordship. O'Neill had to choose a MacCarthy Moor. However, O'Sullivan Moore's rejection undermined the legitimacy of Donald. O'Neill had planned to offer the latter the lordship, but O'Sullivan Moore's actions muddied the waters. Florence MacCarthy finally returned to Munster in late 1599. He had great support among the local lords. Most importantly, O'Sullivan Moore was prepared to give him the white rod. Florence MacCarthy thus had himself inaugurated as MacCarthy Moor in January 1600, probably on Drunghill near Carsarveen in Evora. In March 1600 he met O'Neill, who, despite being initially more inclined to Donald MacCarthy Moor, as he knew the English had allowed Florence to return to Ireland to weaken the Confederacy, had no choice but to leave Florence as MacCarthy Moor, since the latter was strongly supported in the lordship and also had significant Spanish connections. Unfortunately, although Florence MacCarthy had undoubted political skills, as demonstrated in his ascension, as a military leader he would leave much to be desired. Following the fiasco at Essex, Elizabeth turned to Lord Mountjoy. He would finally prove to be the victorious general Elizabeth needed. In part, this was because the downfall of Essex had brought an end to the factionalism that had torn apart the Elizabethan court for years. Part was obviously due to Mountjoy's military skill. Perhaps the most important was that he knew that he had to fight the war in London and in Ireland, and that he knew how to make the most insignificant skirmish into a major military victory. However, Mountjoy would have little impact on Munster or Kerry. Indeed, he only came to Munster for the Kinsale campaign. Appointed at more or less the same time as Mountjoy, George Carew was the new Lord President of Munster. A skilled political operator with the ear of Robert Cecil, who was now running Elizabeth's government, he was almost a rival of Mountjoy. He would rapidly transform the situation in Munster. In March 1600, the Confederate position in the province was very strong. Large parts of Limerick, Cork and Kerry were in their hands. In addition, O'Neill had left a force in Munster composed of around 1,000 Connacht Bonnocks and a few hundred soldiers from Ulster. However, the advantageous Confederate position was very quickly whittled away over the following months. This was due to a number of factors, including the military weakness of the Munster rebels, and their dependence on the forces left behind by O'Neill, and the uninspiring leadership of many of the Confederate lords, notably Florence MacCarthy. Perhaps the most important factor was Carew himself. He would prove a very inspired choice as Lord President of Munster, in contrast to the Confederate leadership of MacCarthy and James Fitz Thomas, the Súgán Earl. Central to Carew's strategy was slowing discord among the Confederates, dividing them, neutralizing as many of the lords as possible, and enticing them to leave the Confederacy. He chose to start with Florence MacCarthy. Carew took command in Munster at the end of April. He initially wanted to neutralize Florence by temporizing with him, in other words, stall him through drawn-out negotiations, thereby allowing Carew to attack the Súgán Earl in the meantime. Florence was reluctant to meet with Carew. He demanded various promises of safe conduct and other guarantees, having already spent many years in the Tower of London. He did not want to risk returning there. Eventually, after further wrangling, Florence met with Carew, to whom he made great protestations of his loyalty, putting on the expected show of repentance and desiring to be a good subject. While negotiating with Florence, Carew was manoeuvring against the Súgán Earl, James Fitz Thomas. He offered Dermot O'Connor money to capture and hand over the latter. Although O'Connor apprehended Fitz Thomas, the plot failed because O'Connor's bonnocks prevented him from handing him over to Carew. An interesting example of the voice of the subaltern speaking out during the war. O'Connor's men may have been mercenaries, but they knew what they were fighting for. In May 1600, Carew took to the field and was immediately successful. On the 21st of May, he set off for Limerick, receiving at Kilmallock the submission of Edmund Fitzgibbon. Afterwards, faced with the cannon Carew had dragged from Limerick, the castles of Bruff and Lochgar surrendered. He also set up a number of new garrisons in Cork and Limerick, especially near Connelloe, an area in the west of Limerick which the Confederates used as a refuge, and around which there were a number of strong castles. Already the Confederacy seemed to be cracking in Munster. Several important lords had begun to look for pardons. However, these distractions were mere nuisances and were insufficient in themselves to deter Carew from his strategy of campaigning as much as possible and dividing the Confederates. In the latter he was successful. With the exception of a few stalwarts, most of the Munster lords started to put out peace feelers. In addition, they began to become suspicious of each other, feelings encouraged and gloated over by Carew. Keeping his army in the field, Carew continued the process of capturing Confederate-held castles. One of the first to fall and scene of the toughest fighting was Glin Castle, held by the Knight of the Valley. The latter, also known as the Black Knight, was one of the 3 Geraldine Knights in Munster. The other 2 were the White Knight and the Green Knight, also called the Knight of Kerry. In Glin Castle, the defenders fought bitterly. Although Carew had captured the young son of the knight and threatened to execute him, the Knight of the Valley refused to surrender unconditionally, and Carew refused terms. Using artillery, the government forces breached the castle defences. After the wall had been breached, the defenders were forced back into the main keep of the castle, but they still fought on, and Carew's men had to win one floor at a time. No prisoners were taken, and some of the defenders actually jumped from the battlements into the nearby river. Carew claimed they were all slain. He also admitted 11 killed and a few wounded, but like all casualty figures of the time, these had to be treated very gingerly. The book, Peccata Hibernia, contains a drawing of the siege, which follows very closely Carew's description. Following this, O'Connor Kerry, who held the strategically important Carrigafoyle castle, which was to be Carew's next target, surrendered. In July, Sir Charles Wilmot was given an independent command in Kerry. He would later be made governor of Castlemaine. Officially, he commanded 1,100 men. However, the real number was probably around half of this. He received some support from local lords who had come over to the English, notably Maurice Stack, a former follower of Lord Fitzmaurice. Stack captured Liscahan Castle and from there carried out raids, burning Ardfert among other places. Wilmot moved on Listowel, seat of Fitzmaurice, Lord Kerry. This fell quickly. It was followed by Rathowen Castle and then Tralee itself. Fitzmaurice besieged Stack at Liscahan, but attempts to storm the castle and entice Stack to surrender failed. Ultimately, Fitzmaurice had to give up the siege. Fitzmaurice's situation was dire. With the fall of Tralee, he was now surrounded. Basically, all he had left were Listowel and Beaulieu, now Ballybunion. As a result, he destroyed Beaulieu and fled into Desmond, the territory of Florence MacCarthy. Fitzmaurice's daughter was married to Donald O'Sullivan Moore, so he had more than one supporter there. For now, he was safe, as Florence was trying to be neutral. However, Florence himself would soon be imprisoned by Carew and removed from the war. Other castles were also captured or surrendered to detachments Carew and Wilmot sent out, such as Rathmore and outfought, while others were destroyed by the Confederates to prevent them being captured, such as Beaulieu and Castle Island, then known as the island of Kerry. In addition, Carew set up numerous garrisons which were busy pillaging and plundering, doing their best to destroy any crops that could be used to support the Confederates, hoping to cause a famine, which they saw as the best way to weaken the Confederate cause. As well as burning crops, the government forces were also busy slaughtering whoever they came across, irrespective of age, sex, or even if they bore weapons. Although many civilians had been slaughtered during the war, the killings would now be carried out much more systematically, though no records were kept of the unimportant women, children, and peasants killed. Within a few months of taking office, Carew had broken the Confederacy in Munster. He claimed to have suffered very few casualties doing this, less than 40 men, in comparison with more than 1,200 Confederates and countless numbers of citizens. The veracity of this casualty figure cannot be ascertained. More than likely, it is inaccurate, though the amount of government losses in battle is largely irrelevant. Irrespective of how many men were killed in battle, the army was losing large numbers of men continually, as Carew himself admits on various occasions. This was through desertion and sickness. Carew had very quickly had a major impact on the province. Within a few months, the Connacht Bonnocks had left, many lords had submitted, the others seemed to be divided and suspicious of each other, and many of the principal Confederate strongholds had been captured. Carew also claimed that the Confederate forces were afraid to take the field against him, though he stressed that his forces should not be reduced. Patrick Fitzmaurice, Lord Kerry or Lord Listowel, died in August 1600, shortly after English forces had captured his main seat of Listowel. Carew claimed he had died of grief. He would be succeeded by his son Thomas, who would also be a strong supporter of the Confederacy. By the end of 1600, the Confederate cause appeared to be lost in Munster. Most of the remaining Confederate strongholds had been taken. In November, Castlemaine was handed back to government forces. At the beginning of December 1600, Listowel, one of the main castles of Lord Listowel, was the last to fall. The fate of this garrison is an illustration of how brutal the war had become. A mine was dug under the castle. Before it was exploded, the garrison offered to surrender if their lives would be spared. Sir Charles Wilmot, commander of the English forces, refused to grant them terms, only allowing them to surrender to his mercy. The garrison did so, but Wilmot's mercy was to hang 9 of them immediately, the same number as the men he had lost in the siege. After consulting with Carew, the remainder were then executed at the latter's order. May 1601 saw the capture of the Súgán Earl, James Fitz Thomas. He was captured by the White Knight who had previously supported the Confederacy. Fitz Thomas would be imprisoned in Munster for a few months before being sent to the Tower of London, where he would die a few years later. The following month was to be Florence MacCarthy's turn. MacCarthy was summoned by Carew under Lord protection. Despite this guarantee, Carew had him arrested. Very soon he'd be back in the Tower. He would remain there until his death in around 1640. Illegally arrested, he was never tried, which was also theoretically illegal. The few Confederate leaders left in Munster were all fugitives, taking refuge wherever they could and with very few troops. Carew claimed that they were all soliciting him to allow them to submit, and that there was no longer a Confederate army in Munster, just a few scattered outlaws. Furthermore, according to the information Carew had received, the surviving Lords John Fitz Thomas, Pierce Lacy, Fitzmaurice and the Knight of Glin had written to O'Neill asking for assistance and sent him money to raise bonnets in Ulster. Failing this, they apparently were planning to flee to Spain. It seemed as if the war in Munster was over. The Confederate cause, which had swept over the province in the aftermath of the Yellow Ford, and which had been given a boost by O'Neill's visit at the beginning of 1600, had collapsed in the face of Carew's offensive and his successful division of the Confederate lords. Nonetheless, it can be argued that despite this rapid collapse, O'Neill had achieved his immediate purpose. Large numbers of troops had been sent to the province, and many would remain there until the end of the war. These men would otherwise have been used elsewhere, such as Mountjoy's attack on O'Neill in May and October 1600. An extra 2,000 or 3,000 men might have made a difference in the battles in the Moray Pass or Carlingford. At the same time, it cannot be denied that the elimination of the Munster Confederates by Carew in a relatively short period of time was impressive. Peace had been achieved in Munster, albeit at a high financial cost. Only one threat remained in the province, one that would become terrifyingly real the next year: a Spanish landing. Thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to the channel, and if you can support it financially, my Buy Me a Coffee account is in the details. I also have YouTube thanks. Finally, for anyone who finds themselves in South Kerry, I do historical walking tours, both privately and for large groups. So, if you want to discover some of the amazing historical places here, get in touch. Maybe, in the future, I'll offer longer tours such as the North Kerry Limerick castles, or indeed 9 Years' War battlefields. Who knows? See you soon. Slán.